Now for today's program. Julie Brill, a lactation consultant, childbirth educator, and doula, is the author of the just released book, Hidden in Plain Sight, a family memoir and the untold story of the Holocaust in Serbia. Her essays have appeared in Haaretz, Balkan Insight, and Hey Alma, among many other publications. Julie shares her family's experience in the Shoah with middle and high school students through Living Links. Amy E. Schwartz is Moment Magazine's book and opinion editor, as well as editor of the magazine's popular Ask the Rabbi section, and she's won first place in commentary from the Religion News Association. Before coming to Moment, Amy was a longtime editorial writer and op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, where she was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in commentary. Amy is president of the non-denominational Jewish Studies Center in Washington, D.C., and is the editor of the book Can Robots Be Jewish and Other Pressing Questions of Modern Life. Please welcome Julie Brill and Amy E. Schwartz.
I wanted to thank you for coming on and for writing this fascinating book. Um, since it's Yom HaShoah, it's good to be discussing this today. And it also, I thought it would make sense to talk about your journey in the context of remembrance. How, on the one hand, how your family story is part of a larger story, and yours is too, but how also at the same time it's a mostly unknown and really in many ways atypical um, part of that story. So I think we'll toggle back and forth between those two aspects of your book. But first of all, let's start with the unusual side of it. Your father was a Holocaust survivor, or came to be defined later in his life as a Holocaust survivor, from Belgrade, which is now the capital of Serbia, and for the oldsters here, which was then at the time the capital of a place called Yugoslavia, which doesn't exist anymore. Tell us why we never hear anything about the Holocaust in Serbia.
Yeah. Hi, Amy. Thanks for that question. I'm so happy to be here. Um, why do we never hear about what happened in Serbia? You need survivors to tell the story. So, Auschwitz was a terrible place, but we all know about Auschwitz because there were tens of thousands of people who survived. Over 1 million people, I think, who were murdered, but there were enough survivors to tell the story and retell the story. In Serbia, we didn't have that. The Holocaust started really early, and by the spring of 1942, it's basically over, and they're declaring Belgrade Judenfrei free of Jews. And so, without survivors and now descendants, it's really not been a story that's been told.
Mhm. You mentioned you said it's a paradox, like the Auschwitz paradox.
Yes, it's called the Auschwitz paradox. If you're familiar with Timothy Snyder, who's a historian, he said that we know about Auschwitz because even though so many people died there, so many people survived. You need the survivors. And so more people were murdered outside the camps than in them, but we don't hear that stories because the job was so complete.
Mhm. So it puts me in mind of, I think it's Primo Levi who said that anytime you hear a story from a survivor, no matter how terrible it is, it's not the real story, because
Right.
the real story was that you didn't survive. That
I
it's
think that's
such
right.
an outlier to have a story at all,
Right.
that it's kind of an illusion that we know anything about what the story really was.
Yes, very much.
Those are reflections for a day like today. But on the plus side, you are descended from your father was an actual survivor, and he has a very very unusual story. It sounds like, as do you. So let's look at a map first. I mean, people say you say in the book how when you were growing up you heard a lot about the Holocaust, but nothing at all about Serbia.
Exactly.
So let's just quickly look at a map. Just for the Europe buffs among us, let's
Absolutely.
tell us
Yeah.
where this stuff is.
Okay, so if you're used to modern Balkan geography, that's the map on the right. And you can see where Serbia is. Belgrade, which is where our story is at that very tip in that pink triangle with the star. It's the capital of Serbia. What happened in World War II is that April 1941, the Holocaust starts in Yugoslavia, World War II starts, and the Germans immediately carve up Yugoslavia. So the map on the right is showing the outline of the former Yugoslavia and what happened to all of those countries. So there's no story of the Holocaust in Yugoslavia because it very much depended on where you were. So Serbia was controlled by the Germans. They were boots on the ground. They were certainly Serbian collaborators, but the Germans were in charge. In Croatia, they let the Croats do it. They said, more brutal than than the Nazis. If you were in the north, that was Hungary, and Hungary was pretty good in the war for Jews until it was terrible at the end. So those are just some examples of where you were really influenced, what happened and when.
So people just don't study these countries, and
No.
these were also, and when this was happening, people still sort of thought Yugoslavia. They didn't think there was no independent Serbia to
Exactly.
the way there is now.
Right.
So yeah, and the community in Belgrade was also interesting, wasn't it? Full of contradictions.
Yeah. So, first of all, it was a multi-ethnic community. So Belgrade is at a crossroads. And so, for example, the synagogue that we went to in Belgrade, which is the last remaining synagogue, is on the street with a Serbian Orthodox church and also with a mosque. So there was a fair amount of tolerance and different religions, people living more or less together, Jews, Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Muslims. And then the Jewish community was very divided, Ashkenazi and Sephardic, and they were pretty separate until pretty recently. They had separate synagogues and cemeteries and schools. They spoke different languages.
And a whole bunch of them were Sephardic Jews who had come from Spain, right? Back in
Yeah, pretty much right at the expulsion, so around
Belgrade
1500.
was when Belgrade was part of the Ottoman Empire, right?
Exactly. Yep.
So it's all very under not badly understood.
And confusing. You can't just
Yeah.
like dabble in it. You really have to look at what was happening to understand.
Right. So that brings us to your story. So tell us how you came to be interested in this. It's not the usual. I mean, often the 2G story. You're a second generation.
Right.
Often people either knew nothing at all and then gradually began to learn the secrets, or some variation on that. And in your case, it's sort of more complicated, right? Like you knew a lot, and then you
Yeah.
didn't think about it all for years, and then you came back to it and you found. Anyway, tell us.
Yeah, that's true. So I think there are survivors who never tell their story. I've met 2Gs who, growing up, they had no idea that, that was their legacy. My father always told his stories, but he was a very young child. So he was born in 1938. He's not even 3 when the war starts. He had these very vivid memories, but I didn't really know how they connected to the larger story of the Holocaust in Serbia, and really he didn't either. So it was finding out the history and plugging these stories into it. And some of them seemed like this couldn't possibly be true. And it was. So he had a story about my grandfather at one point is held at a camp in the center of the city. Um, with Jews and also Roma, and my grandmother brought him food, and I always thought like camps are someplace you go on a train. You can't visit a camp. So that is the history in Belgrade. That is the way it worked. There were
Can
no
you jigger
trains.
the camera again? Do you
I
think
know.
you're
It's
getting
like,
lost in the haze
what is
again? I
happening?
mean, in a weird way, it's okay because you're like a voice coming out of history, but in a weird, and there we go.
I don't want to be a voice. There we go. All right.
Okay, there you
We're
go.
good again.
Okay. Um, well, and sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but also you were talking about, so the story's about a camp, like it's right in the middle of town, and you can go there and bring people food, and
I mean, who heard a
that's
story like that?
and then
Yeah.
that was the camp from which there were zero survivors except for this one baby, right? Or is that
There, no, there are several camps. So that's the camp where the men were held, including my grandfather. The camp that I think you're referring to was a camp that women and children and elderly men were held in, and there were no survivors out of that camp except for one baby who was smuggled out at a couple of days old. And we actually met her. Her name is Esther. And we had a conversation. My cousin translated because I don't speak Serbian and she doesn't speak English. But she was convinced that her parents and my grandparents were friends because they lived across the street from each other and they were the same age. And so it's sort of like this idea, nobody knows, but it's this idea that we are connected.
so we're jumping ahead much
Yeah.
of your journey when you've discovered you have cousins and all you're in Belgrade and all this stuff, but let's go back for a second. We weren't sure if we would do this, but you said you started out with just 4 pictures of your father, and that
Yes.
at least one of them in particular was very mysterious. So
Yeah.
why don't you show us the picture that you can't work well, show them quickly, but it's the
Yeah.
one that I wanted to ask to
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's just 1 through 4. So we had these 4 pictures. This is my father as a baby, and my grandfather. We only have 2 pictures of him. This is winter 38, 39. And we would hold these pictures like, around the edges. They weren't in frames. They came from some envelope in some closet sometimes. And I would just marvel, like, who is this man who I never got to know? Who, do we look alike? What was he like? It was always very mysterious.
so a lot of the book is about this, about the grandfather, particularly about
Yes,
trying to
here's my grandmother and my father before the war. Another sort of mysterious picture. That's actually Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs on that pail. So Disney had arrived in the Balkans. And I look at these pictures, and of course, we know what's coming, and they don't know. This picture is actually from during the war, and it became the cover of the book, Hidden in Plain Sight. So that's my father. He's 5 or 6, and my aunt is the little girl. And we think it was taken in 1943. And if you know the history at all, the Holocaust is over by 1942, essentially, in Serbia because there are no more Jews, and they declare it Juden free of Jews. And here is my father and my aunt, these 2 little Jewish children, on the street, not hiding. And so I always wondered, like, how is this possible? It's really what drove me to write the book, this mystery. And now I understand, like, no one was taking a picture blatantly on the street in German occupied Europe in the World War II. Like, it was illegal to have a camera, it was illegal to take pictures. So that this picture exists is just a great mystery. There's the cover.
Oh, it's interesting. And then, okay, let's wait on the other pictures, but tell us about you. Tell us how you came to, so you took these pictures and that's all you knew and you wanted to know about your grandparents.
Yes. Yeah,
You
I
got
never got to meet either of them.
so
So I was always asking my father for information and stories. He actually doesn't have any memories of his father, so everything that he knew had been handed down, and he handed that down to me. And, he told me some things about my grandmother. But it's really the mystery of them and how the children survived that set me on this journey. I wanted to get to know them.
and like a lot of 2Gs, this became sort of central to your life, right? At a certain point,
it
you
it has been and not, and again, it is, I guess. I was obsessed with it like as a preteen, just reading every book there was, and worried that the Holocaust would come here, worried about who would hide us, what would happen. It did not seem far away. And then after that, I just tried to put it out of my mind completely, which of course doesn't work. And then came back again in midlife to really focus on it.
and then you made you make a very telling comment in the book early on, which I think really encapsulated a lot of things for me, where you say, "I began to understand the improbability of my existence."
Yes.
Can you talk about that in the, I mean, I guess that's a thing about being the child of a survivor, right? How could you possibly, how could these people possibly have made it through?
I mean, you said that before, that like survival is not the norm. So, I mean, Hitler's plan was that none of us would be here. And if you listen to any survivor story, it's always one miracle after another. They're not supposed to be here. For me, once I learned that 90% of the Jews in Belgrade were killed, I really understood, like, there's just, it's wild that we exist.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And your mother took your grandmother took your father and his sister to Israel, right? So there's more steps in the story.
Yeah, in 1948, as soon as they could, they left Belgrade. We have the exit documents, and she didn't even wait to sign them. She had her sister sign them. She was gone. After everything she saw in Europe, she did not want to be part of that anymore. Um, when we saw the camp in the center of Belgrade, I really started to understand, like, it's in the center of the city, and you just imagine the way people walk back and forth now and don't know what was there, that must have been happening during the war as well, when the men were held there. You're going to work, you're going home, you're going to school, you're going to a soccer match, and it's right there in the middle of the city.
Mm. Yeah, you have your book's not political at all, but there's some side comments in there about like people just watching people get deprived of rights and they
I
don't.
mean,
Do you want to fiddle with your camera once more?
I'm so sorry that
No,
this is
no. I mean, you
happening.
don't have to. It's
I just,
we
I
got
don't
you. I
know
mean,
where to go. There I am.
no, there you
Okay.
go. There you are again. Okay. Um, so Say something about the trail of breadcrumbs here. How does it work? It starts with documents, and who's at the other end? Like,
Yeah, I mean, so just one day was online, like I would go and try to like Google again, Jews of Serbia, whatever, try to get like a nugget. And I saw the Jewish Museum. I showed my dad a picture of it, and he said, "That's where we lived after the war." It's like, you did? You lived in the building where the Jewish Museum is? Okay. And then I wrote to them without any expectation that they would write me back. And pretty quickly, I had just a trail of documents. So generations and generations of Brill's birth certificates and marriage certificates. And my dad is the last one in that chain, 1938. My aunt actually doesn't have a birth certificate at all. And that's when I started to think, oh, there is information out here, and also we are rooted in this place, and how can I find out? Because all the Jewish genealogy is like how to find your ancestors in Germany or Poland, and there's no pathway like that for Serbia.
right. But it turns out there are people in Serbia, collecting.
Yes.
How many Jews are there now in Belgrade? What kind of a community is it?
I
Obviously, they're there working away on their documents.
Yeah, there are people in the Jewish Museum. We met many people in, different capacities who are Jewish who live there. I don't know the number. We heard that half the surviving Jews left in the 90s in the Balkan Wars. It's a small community, small but mighty.
Right. And now, probably because of this book, more people coming through, I would think,
I hope so. Yeah.
maybe. And you met other people on this pathway. Once you started
Yes.
going there, you
Yeah. I
met
mean,
other Americans.
every time an article came out, somebody would write me and say, "We thought we were the only ones. Your story is like our story." And I thought, like, we're probably all related because there was so much intermarriage. It's not just like finding someone from the community, like, you're probably my cousin.
That's funny. And then you say, once you go there, you meet all these cousins. Suddenly,
Yes,
there's
we
all the,
met real cousins. Like, I mean, people
right,
we knew
actual
for sure were cousins. Yeah. We found through the process a cousin whose grandfather and my father's grandfather were twins, maybe identical twins. They looked very similar in the pictures she shared with us. So that was amazing. We didn't know there were any other survivors in the family. And we had at that point already started working on this project to get the Stolpersteine, the memorial stones, the first ones put into Belgrade, the capital city. And it turned out that one of the people we were working for was her grandmother. So it was just like, it felt very connected and very meaningful.
Since you've mentioned the Stolpersteine, we were gonna get to that at the end, but say a little bit about that. I'm sure a lot of people who have uh, tuned in for this call are familiar with this memorial initiative, but talk about it a little bit.
Sure, the Stolpersteine are the largest decentralized monument in the world. And what they are is these little stones. They're like this big. They could fit in the palm of your hand. And they go in the ground in front of the last voluntary residence of survivors and victims of the Holocaust. And when we went to Belgrade for the first time, my dad and my daughter and I in 2017, we went to where my dad had lived, and it was a Jewish neighborhood, but it's not anymore. There just aren't enough Jews. And it just felt like, no, does anyone know what happened here? Does anyone remember? I really wanted a sign, and that's really what it is. And so I started on the project to get them. I now understand it's actually impossible. Fortunately, I didn't know that at the time. People who know more than I do said, yeah, we didn't think you'd ever be able to do it. But in 2022, the first 10 of these Stolpersteine went into the ground in Serbia, in Belgrade, and 3 were for my family.
So it's a term, it means stumbling stones, right? So they
Stumbling
actually
stone, yeah.
stick
And if
up a
anyone
little
is a
bit from
German
the
speaker,
ground.
I'm sorry
No,
for
no, they
whatever
stick up,
the words coming out of my mouth are.
but it's a very powerful symbol because they stick up
Yeah.
a little bit from the ground. You kind of trip
Yes.
over them. They're supposed
Yes.
to stop you for a second, and then the name and last known address and then the date of deportation or murder is on them, and so you know this.
Yes. You can
Yeah,
actually get a surprising amount of information. You can really understand the story just looking at these little stones.
and Serbia had never had any.
They had never had any, there weren't any monuments at all with the names of victims on them.
You talk about that too, and that's one of the sort of striking things in the book when you talk about your trip and you go to all these places, and some of them your father remembers, and some of them he doesn't remember, and some of them have some history, and then you say the worst thing is to go to the park where the real killing took place, and although
Yes.
there's a memorial, there are no names.
Right. Right. And like no one there. I mean, it was just a very strange place. So the way that it worked was the Jews of Belgrade, other people too, but the Jews were rounded up, so they were easy to use, were shot in retribution when a German soldier was killed. So every time a German soldier was killed by the partisans, they shot 100 civilians. And so that's how they went through this camp. That's why there weren't any survivors from the camp where my grandfather was. And it was right in the city. And I mean, there are also Serbs who were buried there and other people. And it's just a mass grave. It's just a sort of a mound.
Oh, you can't see anything about it. And
You can't say anything.
that's at the camp, the site of
No, they moved
the,
them to another location, but all of it is very close. It's the same city.
yeah. And is there a mass grave there, or
It's a mass grave. It's a
it's a
mass
mass
grave.
grave and it's not marked with, well, no
I
name?
mean,
Yeah,
yeah. And then
oh, you know.
we mentioned the other camp where the women and children were. They were also buried there. They used a mobile gas van, and then the final destination was this mass grave.
So it's interesting. I guess you could say that people in the Balkans have had during the 90s when other countries were starting to come to grips with this and put together a culture of remembrance, Serbia was kind of busy.
Yeah, yeah,
And
they
they
were.
were they were having, this terrible war that some people, I covered it, was that some people thought, was almost Holocaust level human rights abuses in
Yeah.
some
Yeah, certainly a genocide. I mean,
genocide, first
yeah,
genocide of its kind in Europe since the Holocaust, people kept saying. So
right.
did that resonate at all? You're traveling through these places and meeting these Serbian relatives. Was there any sense of, this intervening war and all these
I mean,
suffering?
people are talking about it. We met a cousin who fought in that war. You know, they've kept the building that NATO bombed. It's still a broken building in Belgrade. I mean, they very much are still talking about it. I definitely think that's part of why there's been such a slow response from the Serbian government to talk about this genocide, the Yom HaShoah genocide that we're focused on, because of their own history with, more recent genocide in Bosnia.
Right. Yeah. There's another interesting point in the book. I mean, there are a lot of interesting things in the book, but one scene that really struck me is where you and your family on your second trip, where you really got a lot of information now, and you're at the cemetery where your great grandfather's grave is, and there are some other some of his children are memorialized on the edges of the grave, and so there's a bunch of names, and you note that none of these family members buried in the cemetery, and this is before the Holocaust. They died in their in their beds basically.
Right.
Um, None of them was born in Belgrade. They were all from somewhere else.
Yes, yes, that's true.
So
So it's a generation up. It's my father's grandparents, and they came from Upper Hungary.
so is that also a function of like this being such a crossroads, or is it just wandering Jews?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. My family is Ashkenazi and Sephardic. The Sephardic part had been there for centuries, but not actually in Belgrade. The Ashkenazi part had come from Upper Hungary, and that was the sort of the history. They came in the mid 1800s when the borders opened up to them.
Hmm. So you say something else sort of interesting before we get back to the actual story. You make a comment. I think it was apropos of some of these visits. You say, "I've always been more comfortable in cemeteries than in synagogues."
Yeah, I love cemeteries. I just think they're so interesting. I mean, we're talking about the stories that you can find off the Stolpersteine, but I mean off of cemetery stones as well. And I live in New England, and we have a lot of cemeteries here, and I was always fascinated, and jealous of people that had roots in those cemeteries. I don't. And so to go to Belgrade and really stand in that cemetery, that's really one of those moments when I realized we're from here. If having your grandparents in the ground is what makes you from a place, my dad is from Belgrade. We're from Belgrade.
That's interesting. Yeah. What was this all like for him? I mean, he came on both of these trips. Did he feel like he was really, was there a process for him? Did he feel at home there?
I think he very much did feel at home there. The Serbians in general are so welcoming. There's a long tradition of Serbs for a variety of reasons leaving and coming back, and they're welcomed, and it says Belgrade on his passport for place of birth. And so it was very clear that he was from here, even just coming through the airport. And everybody welcomed him back. And, the Serbian started to come back, the language. And, he just has a map in his head of the streets. So at one point where the guide's car breaks down and we get out of the car and we just walk back to the hotel, and we'd driven in this big circle, but he knew where we were. We just like, we weren't that far. We just like kind of beeline for it. So those were really parts where I thought like, oh yeah, this is his home.
That's interesting. And how did the relationship between you and him evolve as a result of all this?
I think that we're closer. I mean, I think that he was interested. He was on his own. He was definitely interested because I was interested. And then it became a thing that we did together. And I would find things and it would trigger memories. And then he would tell me something and I would go look for it. And having that information for him was like, I think it was fulfilling, like I filled in some pieces that he didn't know.
And then there were times later in the book when he would suddenly come up with a story that he'd never told you.
Memory is wild, right? Like, where did that come from? Yeah, like he hadn't remembered it and then he did. I mean, we had a moment when we were outside the hotel in Belgrade and we're standing on the street and he said, "Oh, my aunt lived over there." And she did. Like, you're literally from this block, and the memory was she was like a sad old person who had lost her only son in the war, and they were going to say goodbye in 1948. So he went with his mother and his sister, and I had never thought about that part. Like, of course, they went to Israel, and the leaving wasn't the story; it was the arriving. But there was this leaving first, this saying goodbye forever.
Huh. Right, even to family.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, that's an interesting story too. And you didn't know your grandmother either, right? So all of this
no,
is, so you had to reconstruct this person who saved the kids and got them away
yeah,
from from scratch. And that's one of the mysteries that you unravel in your
yeah,
book. So
yeah.
I won't do any spoilers. It's a story with a lot of secrets.
Like any family story, I
Yeah,
think.
right,
But
exactly.
my grandmother died when she was 50, which I'm going to be 55, so that doesn't seem old anymore, but I should have known her. I should have known both my grandparents. And I really think she died of a broken heart. She was always waiting for my grandfather. She thought he was going to come home. And of course, he couldn't.
Because the he disappeared from this camp that was emptied.
Right. And the rumors were that they had moved the men to work, which, you can say, oh, that's like wishful thinking, but it makes more sense. Why would they murder young, healthy men who could be working for the Reich, right? So it made sense that he was somewhere else and he would come home. He was only in his early 30s.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of so when did you find, I mean, you start out as a preteen and then as a then later when you plunge into this, you start out with this feeling that your story is so different from everybody else's story.
Yeah.
Um, did that change? Do you feel, I mean, you just said now, oh, every family's got secrets. Do you feel differently about your story now, or does it still seem strange?
I said every family has secrets because now that the book is out, people are telling me their secrets.
Oh,
Not
interesting.
necessarily Holocaust related, just family secrets. Um, I'm sorry, I lost the other part of your question.
No, I'm just curious if you start to feel like less of an outlier, like the more like these stories all kind of converge in any way.
I mean, what's been really great, meeting a few people who have similar stories, but also just being accepted into the 2G, 3G community. Lots of the survivor stories actually are improbable and kind of outlandish. And like, I have just found sort of a community there that I wasn't expecting that's been warm and welcoming. So that's been really great. As my dad started to see himself as a survivor, then I started to see myself as a 2G.
Let me ask you more about that, because I've heard other people say, "Oh, I never thought of myself as a survivor until recently," but
Yeah.
somehow is that where's that coming from?
I mean, I think the survivors that we have left with us were children in the war, and there were very few children who survived the camps. So they were hidden, or they were kinder transport, or they got out in some way. And that was not really the original definition of a survivor. Survivor meant you had numbers on your arm, you had come through a camp, so I think as the definition has gotten more broad, more people are encompassed in that. And also, I think there's just been a changing attitude now. People are interested in hearing those stories. Initially in the 40s and 50s and even 60s, I don't think that was true.
And I suppose some of those people also were they would say to themselves, "Oh, what happened to me wasn't so bad."
Right. There's
Because
certainly
they said,
somebody
"Oh,
with a worse
I was
story.
fine," you know,
Yeah, yeah.
um, but compared to what they had heard. But yeah, no, it's interesting. Let me. I was just wondering. This well, first of all, I'd be curious. You say people are coming up to you and telling you their secrets. Like, tell us more about that. You
I
know,
didn't expect it. Yeah, just I think, and I have been on the other side of this many times, but when you read a memoir, you feel like you know the person. It's kind of like a parasocial relationship. I don't necessarily know them, but because I have said what happened in my family, they just sort of feel free to share their story. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, secrets are
so,
interesting. They're always like known and unknown. Like, the story sort of is what people are saying is, yeah, I never knew this thing, but I kind of did. It answers some questions. I always thought it was funny that. So
well, sort of like in your case, where your father had these stories that he would tell, but they didn't really make sense,
they didn't really make
right?
sense, partly because the Holocaust in Yugoslavia and Serbia was so different than what we had learned about Poland and Germany, partly because he was a little child, partly because there were things that we didn't know that we do now that fit in the missing pieces.
Right. You say every time you would ask him how he survived, he would say some variation on, "Well, my mother and my grandmother, they were so tough. Those
Yeah.
tough women. No one could hurt me when they were around."
Yeah. I mean, it's a little boy's view of the world, right? My grandmother was able to not just keep him safe, but make him feel like he was safe. I mean, while the Germans were boots on the ground in their neighborhood. I mean, it really is outstanding. But, in early childhood education, we learn about the first 1,000 days, the first 3 years. And my father almost got that. Like his family was intact almost till three. And I think that also helped him a lot.
Oh, that's interesting. You're an early childhood educator and a doula, right? Or you
I'm a lactation consultant, so we work with families in those first 1,000 days. Yeah.
so you see this. That's interesting. That's an interesting way to be able to frame your father's experience then.
Yeah. It's the things that happen to children before they have memory and can go back and reinterpret them that are maybe the most profound.
Sort of give them their sense of whether the world is a safe place or not.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
That's interesting. So was it hard for your father to start thinking of himself as a survivor then?
I mean, I think it was a process. I wish he could answer the question. I think it would be a better question for him, but I think it was a process of him sort of reinterpreting what had happened, and being more public with the story that made him think of himself that way. I mean, and also all these other people who were thinking of him that way,
Right.
reflecting it back to him.
Right. So I want to go back just a little bit to the Holocaust in Serbia, the Holocaust.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like you learned a ton more about all these sort of intersecting ethnicities and
Yes.
all these people who, um, so the people who got when anyone who left would have left sort of before the, um, so talk about the resistance, how this all started. Just give us just sketch a little bit of the history.
Yeah, so the plan for Hitler was not to fight with Yugoslavia. He wanted to make an agreement with Yugoslavia and just go on to the Soviet Union. And initially, it looks like that's what's going to happen. The king agrees to a pact, and it's all done. And then the Yugoslavian people, but really the Serbs in Belgrade, find out what's happening, and they do not want to be part of a pact with Germany. And so they really force their government to undo the pact. They get rid of the king who's holding the seat for his nephew, who was thought to be too young. They bring in this teenage king who gets rid of the pact, and they know that it will be war. They choose war over an agreement with Germany that probably would have saved lives. And then once the occupation starts pretty quickly, by June, July, there's the partisan movement. There's an army fighting, a citizen army fighting the Germans, as well as the royalists who are also fighting the Germans, but fighting the partisans as well. So it's a complicated story.
And then after the war, when when they fall in the Soviet sphere of influence, Tito was a partisan, right? Is
He
that
was the head of the
vaguely,
partisans.
right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
that's
he
right.
becomes the president of Yugoslavia, and so Yugoslavia has this slightly kind of, they're not neutral, but they have a little bit more maneuvering room than the rest of the bloc,
Right. It's really not
right?
behind the Iron Curtain in the same way. Yeah. But it was a one-man job. Like no one else could do it. When he died, there was no way that it could continue to be that.
Right, right. And so the people you're meeting when you go back to Serbia have all these very complicated, this very interesting post-war backstory also.
Yeah, yeah, and they're all saying like the world does not know this story. Like it says we don't, as Jews, we don't know the story of the Holocaust in Serbia, but as citizens of the world, we don't know the history of that part of Eastern Europe. It's like almost beyond what Europe is in people's minds. My cousin said people think we're either from Syria or Siberia, like they just don't know.
Right. What's Serbia? Where is, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, that's well, that also helps explain another impression I got from the book, which, I mean, you say that the more you went back, you met all these cousins, the Serbs, you felt very, you started to feel comfortable there. You started to feel like your family was from there. You felt almost you were warm and welcomed. This is not the tone that emanates from the stories of 2Gs who go back to Poland.
I think the story in Poland is very different. I mean, my impression is that there's not that long-lived anti-Semitism as much, that was a much more diverse community and there was much more tolerance. The different religions had their own leaders and were able to do. That's why I got those documents from the museum, the Jewish museum. They did their own births and marriages and deaths. They did a lot of that and they had the freedom to do it. And also, I think there just weren't as many Jews, where there are 3 million plus Jews in Poland. So it was just a much larger community.
Right. But it sounds like also if there was this memory of resistance,
Yes,
partisan
yes,
and all that, and all this fighting. It has a slightly different tone.
I agree. They say that the Serbs would rather go to war than go to work. Like they're just not going to take it sitting down. There have been so many wars. They lost more people in World War One than any other country. I mean, there's a long history of it.
Yeah, well, and then they're right there in the middle of, I mean, they're just,
Yeah, yeah.
what is the joke about Belgium? They call it like the swinging door, the screen door of Europe. Everyone passes through, slam, slam.
Yeah, I think
But
so.
no, that's interesting. So let's talk a little more about the book, about the experience of writing the book. And I want to go back to this idea that the story is so, you're in this very unusual story from this very unusual, kind of part of the Holocaust, but it's also, you're also now sort of part of a community of commemoration, and the Stolpers Steiner are one thing, it's sort of someone it was just it's such a brilliant idea because it sort of works everywhere. But just writing the book, I mean, how did you, first of all, how did you reach the point where you realized you were going to have to actually write a book about this?
I kept thinking that someone else would write the book. Like the early years in the project, I was just like, I'm just writing this for my family. Someday my kids will want this information and my niece and my nephew, and someone else surely will like write this book because there is no book on the Holocaust in Serbia. And at some point, it became clear that I was the person writing that book. That I think it's Maya Angelou said, "Write the book you want to see in the world."
Mm.
I wanted that hole to be filled. I didn't want the gap. And so, as I was writing, I was thinking about how this really is a bigger story than just my family story. Initially, I wrote it, I wanted to just talk about my family and the larger story. And the feedback early on was all like, it's a memoir. You just don't know it yet. You have to put yourself in it. We need to know, like, through your eyes, what's happening and what you're thinking. And so
Um,
that's the final form.
excuse me.
Of course.
Also, excuse me. You keep talking for a second. I'm gonna.
Okay. Um, yeah. So, um, writing the book for me was really a process of understanding what the greater story was and how much of that story to put. And as I went on, more and more of it became about my family and my family story, and enough in there that you probably, can get to know me a little bit as well.
Oh,
Amy.
there's a, yeah. No,
Yeah.
I was hoping that would not happen during this, but for whatever reason. Anyway, and you do have there's a point where you have you found so many cousins that they are, you can keep them straight, but
Yeah,
actually
maybe I had to write it all down. My mother was always like, "Who are they again? And where do they come? What side?" Like, and
right,
we would go and look at the tree because it's very confusing. And the names repeat in every generation. There's again people with the same names.
right. They're all named Alexander Brill, right?
There is a repetition of that. Yeah. So I put a family tree in the beginning to like help the reader. Yeah.
Right, right. Well, and you also mentioned because they're Sephardim, at least on one side,
Yes.
they name after the living.
Exactly. So that
So,
was part of the mystery. My father is named after his grandfather Heinrich, and Heinrich was at the bris, so we know he was a lot, so like I never understood that tradition.
huh. And now then you found
Oh, now I've
Christ.
lost volume.
Oh, no, it's okay. I can hear you.
Oh, good. Okay,
Yeah, no, you're fine. Um,
good.
so, I was gonna ask about so what, and then once you'd written the book, you've been kind of on, just started to go on tour with it, right? But you're meeting
The
people and you're getting
yes.
kind of what kind of I mean, are you meeting other Serbian Jews?
I have met some. I had written some sort of companion essays to the book over the last few years, so I have been collecting people as I've gone along, and we have been comparing notes. I mean, we don't know how many of us there are, but it's a very small number.
Are they, and they're all named Brill, right? Or a lot of them.
Well, my family is. Yeah, I'm looking for other people, that we know for sure are relatives, but again, it feels like we all are related.
You said at the beginning of the book, you said, well, everybody, you're related to just these four people who.
Yeah, and now there's a much, much broader
Yeah,
family that we didn't know about.
no, that's right. So, and just one more question about the book is, again, like you published the book through this thing called Amsterdam Press, and it's not self-published, but I mean, it's a real press, but it's not a trade press. And I looked at the back, and it's really looks like it's an endeavor for publishing stories like this, for publishing
Yes.
their Holocaust memoirs or 2G memoirs. So, can you talk a little bit about that? Because it seems like that too, that's like an interesting thing for the culture to be doing.
Yeah, I was lucky to find them. They're called Amsterdam Publishers. They're based in Amsterdam. The woman who runs it, Lisbeth, is Dutch, not Jewish, and has just taken on this mission to tell as many of these stories as she can, or to help tell them, get them out into the world. She does a fiction component, but it's mostly survivor memoirs, and then, as you said, 2G and 3G. It's where the book found a home, so I feel really grateful.
So wait, is she doing all languages or just English? Because
The books, yeah, they all come out in English first, and then a number of them have been translated into German, into Hebrew, and often into the local language. So I'm hoping Hidden in Plain Sight will be translated into Serbian.
I would think.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, and when it is, if or when it is, it'll be on every bookshelf. I'm not,
I mean that
I mean,
that's the
I'm
hope.
thinking,
Yeah,
when you go into the train station or whatever, it'll be the one book.
yeah. I mean
But
that story is not widely known in Serbia either. So same hole I want to fill.
interesting. Yeah, no, it's just so, and do they provide mentorship or anything, or you reach them and they say yes, and then you send them a manuscript, or
You send them the manuscript, they read the manuscript, and manuscripts are approved or not approved. I mean, she's a small press. I think maybe there are 15 books coming out this year. So, she's not able to take all of them, but you would submit a full manuscript.
it's just an interesting. I just think it's an interesting. I mean, here we are. It's Yom HaShoah. Fewer, you're dealing with a decreasing stream of memories, but somehow, the thing that's amazing to me is somehow there's always more. There's always more to know.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we think of history as being like, oh, we learned it already, right? But we're actually learning more history all the time.
Right, right. And then these structures kind of evolve to help it go on.
Right. Right.
So it's interesting. I don't want to suggest it's in any ways a good news story, but at least it's something to go forward with.
Yeah. I mean, I'm grateful that these stories are being told. I think they're important.
So I don't want to monopolize you the entire hour. Let's see if there are any questions. Suzanne, have you got anything? And thank you, Julie. Thank you so much for writing this and for talking about it and for coming on.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Amy and
Yes,
Suzanne. I
thank you
really appreciate it.
so much.
Yeah.
As we've gotten a lot of comments, especially before the event, as people were registering, saying that they really appreciated having the opportunity to hear about the Holocaust in Serbia, or that they themselves were from that area, but didn't know much. You mentioned just a few minutes ago that the people in Serbia today also don't know much about this.
Right.
Is it that they don't know much about it, or do they deny that it's part of the Holocaust?
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily Holocaust denial. I mean, what happened after the war was Tito, who we mentioned earlier, was unifying this multi-ethnic, diverse Yugoslavia. We were just talking about the ethnicities in Serbia, but Yugoslavia was very diverse. And there had been so much suffering in the war. It's something like 200,000 Serbs were murdered, really as part of a genocide as Holocaust victims, and as partisans and just as victims of the occupation. And so the idea was we were kind of all victims of fascism, and we're not going to talk about the different ethnicities. We're going to try to unite people. And so, under communism, there really wasn't religion, and this idea of different ethnicities was kind of swept under the rug. Then when communism ends, um, now they're anti-communist. And so when they were communist, they were anti-fascist. But as they became anti-communist, there was like less room to be anti-fascist. And so there's still like not a lot of interest in talking about it. We wanted to see when we went to Belgrade, there was a monument with the names of partisans who died on it. We have my great uncles were on that monument. We wanted to see it, and it doesn't exist anymore. They took it down. They're not like talking about that at all anymore. They've moved on. But now they want to get into the EU, so there's some movement, I think, towards recognition. It's complicated.
Somebody asked if, do you know if there is anti-Semitism or a rise in anti-Semitism today in Serbia?
That's a great question. I don't know specifically that there is a rise in anti-Semitism, like maybe what we're seeing here and in Western Europe. There's a lot of resistance right now against the government. So there's a huge student-led movement of strikes and protests, and there's a lot of things that are shifting. So hopefully everything will become a little more democratic and open.
Huh. Is that because the Serbian Orthodox Church is allied with the Russians? Because I know they have been off and on.
Yeah, so I mean, Serbia straddles that line between East and West. You even see it with the alphabets. Like, are they using Cyrillic? Are they using the Latin letters? Which way are they looking? I mean, I think it depends on who you ask and when.
Yeah, you mentioned there's one point in the book where you talk about like you go to this suburb across the river, and the suburb was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Yes.
And it was Catholic, and they speak German there or whatever. And then, back on the other side, it was never, it was in the Ottoman Empire, and it was, it was Serbian Orthodox and Christian, and they use Cyrillic, and it's just this river.
It was fascinating to see that. And you can see the other side of the river, and and historically there weren't easy crossings. We just drove over a bridge and then we came back for dinner. It was very close, but just to see how different things had been historically. Yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody asked if you have come across other examples of Jewish children who had survived from Serbia.
So I know one other family where their dad survived, was sort of taken in by another family, and was treated like he was one of their own children during the war. But we have lists of the survivors who were living in Belgrade after the war, who were getting aid, basically American aid, food. And my father and my aunt are the only children on that list. So in Belgrade, it doesn't look like there were.
Wow.
Yeah.
Huh.
You, in the intro, I had mentioned that you talk about this to students. You go into
Yeah.
classrooms. Are you going into public schools, Jewish schools, and what's the response been?
I haven't gone into any Jewish schools. It's through Living Links. It used to be through 3GNY. And the classrooms reach out. A lot of them times the teachers have to meet certain Holocaust curriculum, and we help them do that. Um, it has been really meaningful to me. How meaningful it often is to the students. They don't necessarily know the story. They've like read Night or something. They've had this little like preview into the Holocaust. But I think what makes this kind of storytelling so helpful is I'm not talking about 6 million people. I'm talking about my grandfather and this is his name and this is what he looked like and this is what happened to him. And that kind of connection, to one person, I think is really the level at which probably most of us can understand what happened.
Yeah. And do you know what happened in other parts of Serbia?
So the northern part of Serbia was Hungarian. So it's the Hungarian story where Hungary is basically protecting their Jews until the very end when they're not. And they mostly, I think, went to Auschwitz by train. That's a very different story. In most of Serbia, the Holocaust is very local and very early. There are no trains, there are no gas chambers. It's just really where they're living. Before anyone really has a chance to understand what's happening, before the final solution is decided on, before there's really an opportunity to get out.
Yeah. I rushed you past this earlier because I didn't think we'd have time, but maybe you want to show that last picture of all the men gathered up. Suzanne, can you find it? The one at the it's number 6, I think. Um,
I've stared at this picture so much. So my dad always says, somebody took a picture of this. This is the Jewish men of Belgrade, including my grandfather and my great uncle. And they have been registered. They're on the list now with the Germans for slave labor, but they don't yet have their armbands. And they're standing in this fortress, Kalamagdan, which is the ancient part of Belgrade that's now a city park. Um, just kind of waiting. And the guy in the front row in his suit is like looking at his watch, like maybe he's going to make a train. Um, my grandfather is in this picture. So we only have the wedding picture of my grandfather and the picture of my grandfather with my father as a baby. And this picture is probably the third picture, but I haven't been able to find him. Someone told me with facial recognition technology now that it probably is possible that we could probably find him in that crowd, but
Wondering
he's
about
there.
AI. Yeah, AI might be.
Yeah, that there's some way to do it. But you go there now, it's this lovely central park if you wanted to have a picnic or throw a frisbee, and you would never know that that's what happened in 1941.
Except something.
You mentioned that you went to the area where the mass grave is,
Yeah.
not marked. Someone wanted to know if people who live in Belgrade now have any idea that that is a mass grave.
I don't believe so. It's very park-like, but you are unlike what we just were talking about with Calamagnon, you are not supposed to go there to walk your dog or hang out. I don't think that local people necessarily go there. The big monument to the Holocaust is made out of the rubble of the buildings that were bombed in the Jewish neighborhood, but it's behind the fence of the Sephardic synagogue, so it's there. But again, I think most people, unless you went to that cemetery, you wouldn't see it. It's hidden in plain sight.
Just real quickly, you've mentioned 2G and 3G
Mhm.
several times. For those who don't know, can you explain what that means?
Of course. So their survivors, their children are 2G. It stands for second generation. And then our children are 3G, third generation. A lot of the 2Gs, like could be my parents, were born in the camps immediately after the war, the displaced persons camps. And then I'm sort of like in the middle between the generations. That's part of what we are talking about before, with like trying to find out where I fit. But it just means that we've inherited this legacy of the Holocaust.
Thank you. And as we wrap up, I mean, Amy already mentioned that, there's this publishing house that you used that publishes books solely about the Holocaust. But what advice do you have for anybody who is seeking to share their family story? How long did this process take you to do from the time you actually started your research to the coming to the fruition of your book?
Yeah, so I started in 2017 when my younger daughter left for college, and it's 2025, so 8 years. I mean, for somebody who's interested in doing this, I mean, it's like any genealogy. So you start by interviewing your older family members and writing everything down and recording it, and then interviewing them again on a different day and asking the questions slightly differently, and doing whatever research you can do and asking them questions about that. For me, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC was very helpful. They can access these records that are only really recently available, and we did the search under my father's name. So if you have a survivor who's still living, they expedite it, and so that was very helpful. There tends to be these families where very little is known and there's like not much story, but a lot of families there is quite a bit that's known. Um, yeah. I hope that's helpful. Write it down, do it, find out what you can.
Thank you. And I will just let you know, and for the people who wrote in, several people, more than one, wrote in saying that they would like to be in touch with you because they have their roots in
Because we're related.
Uh,
probably. So I
Yeah.
will privately share their contact information
Yeah. I mean,
for you.
my website is juliebrill.com and there's a contact form there. So anyone who wants to can reach out that way.
Great.
Yeah,
And
please do.
I put the link to the website in the chat where you can also find links there to buy the book. This program, as I mentioned at the beginning, is recorded. It'll be on our website tomorrow morning, and I will send a follow-up email that will include the link as well. Again, Julie, thank you so much for sharing your story. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and we will see everybody next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.